This is a story worth every second of your time. The hall held its breath. 100 conversations stilled into murmurs as Jasmine Crockett stepped inside, her figure framed against the towering wooden doors. She moved with quiet purpose, her tailored suit neat, her expression composed, but the weight of the moment pressed gently against her ribs. She wasn't just entering a room, she was stepping into a lineage built by those who had fought long before her. Faces turned, some curious, some knowing, and she met their gaze with a nod that said, "We carry the same fire." The soft lighting caught the glint in her eyes as she moved toward the front, each step threading her deeper into the promise that this gathering held. She didn't rush, she didn't shrink. She let the silence acknowledge her presence without apology. Somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "This is bigger than you. Step forward anyway." Then a shift, almost imperceptible at first, the way a room senses a storm before it breaks. The back doors opened, and there she was. Oprah Winfrey. No stage lights, no entourage, just her, and yet the very air seemed to realign around her arrival. For a heartbeat, no one clapped. They just stared, stunned into stillness by the sheer inevitability of her presence. Then the applause began, rising like a wave Jasmine could feel vibrating in her bones. She turned, and in that instant, their eyes locked. Jasmine's wide with awe, Oprah's steady and warm, as if seeing a future she had long hoped would come. Oprah's smile reached across the space between them, gentle and sure, and when she spoke, it felt less like words and more like a door quietly opening. "I've been watching you for a long time." The room hushed into a different kind of silence, the kind reserved not for performances, but for confessions. Oprah stepped forward, her hands relaxed at her sides, her presence filling the space not with grandeur, but with a simple, undeniable gravity. Her voice, when it came, was soft, yet sharp enough to carve through the breathless air. "When I was first hired at a television station," she began, "I thought I had made it. I thought hard work and preparation had opened the door." She paused, letting the memory settle between her and the crowd, every face leaning closer, drawn into the quiet fracture in her tone. "But it didn't take long before they sat me down. A man in a crisp suit, someone who smiled like he meant well, told me that my hair was too ethnic, that if I wanted to stay on air, I needed to adjust." Her voice didn't break. It didn't need to. The calmness made the violence of the words even clearer, sharper. She looked out across the room, her gaze sweeping past Jasmine and into the invisible past she carried with her. They said America wasn't ready, that the audience would be uncomfortable. A thin, bitter smile crossed her lips, gone in an instant. They offered me solutions. Straighten it, lighten it, tame it, make myself smaller, safer, palatable. The words hit like slow, deliberate hammer strikes. Jasmine felt them land in her own chest, each syllable another reminder of the quiet betrayals stitched into so many so-called opportunities. Oprah inhaled deeply, her shoulders rising and falling in a slow, deliberate rhythm, as if breathing life into the girl she had once been, sitting in that office, being told her very existence needed edits. "It wasn't just about hair," she said, her voice steady now, low and resonant. "It was about erasure, strand by strand, smile by smile, compromise by compromise, until there would be nothing left but a version of me they could control." For a moment, no one moved. The chandeliers above flickered slightly, or maybe it was just the shimmer of tears in more than a few eyes. Oprah stood in that stillness, not pleading for sympathy, not asking for outrage, but offering a piece of herself, whole and unvarnished, to those who needed it most. Jasmine's hands curled lightly in her lap, knuckles whitening, not from anger but from recognition, an understanding so deep it didn't need words. Across the hall, breaths were held, throats tightened, hearts broke and rebuilt themselves within the span of a single story. Oprah's voice softened, almost a whisper, but it carried as if stitched into the bones of every person present. "They wanted to edit me into something safer. I chose to stay whole instead." The weight of Oprah's story still hung in the air, wrapping around every breath, pulling the room into a deeper silence, as if the walls themselves were listening for what would come next. Jasmine shifted slightly in her seat, feeling the edges of old memories scrape against the surface of her calm. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She let it stretch, let it breathe, because she knew the truth deserved more than hurried words. Her hands folded loosely in her lap, but her voice, when it came, was steady and sure, each syllable carried with the careful weight of lived experience. When I first got elected to Congress, she began, her eyes not looking at anyone in particular, but seeing everyone all the same, I thought the hard part was getting through the election. A soft, almost bitter smile flickered across her face. There and gone. Turns out, winning wasn't the finish line. It was just the start of a whole different fight. She paused, the memory pressing down against her ribs. It wasn't the shouting on the house floor that cut the deepest. It was the little moments, the compliments that came with a but, the friendly advice wrapped around a warning. She blinked once, slowly, as if clearing the sting from her eyes before it could surface. Nobody came right out and said it. They didn't have to. It was there in the glances, in the quiet little nudges. You look strong, Jasmine, but maybe try something softer next time. You're passionate, but maybe don't push so hard when you talk about race. Your natural hair is beautiful, but have you thought about straightening it for the cameras? Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the armrest, a tension she'd trained herself not to show. They never told me to stop speaking. They just told me how to package myself so people would feel comfortable enough to listen. Her voice didn't crack. It sharpened, low and even. It wasn't hate. It was something quieter. It was survival advice, dressed up like a compliment. For a long moment, she let the silence reclaim the room, a silence so dense it seemed to hum in the walls. Then she turned slightly toward Oprah, her voice dropping lower, more vulnerable, more raw. Was there ever a time you thought about giving up? She asked, her words trembling with the weight of unspoken struggles. Not because you couldn't fight, but because it would have been easier just to live a little quieter. The question didn't hit like a hammer. It unfurled, slow and heavy, like a secret long hidden. Oprah's eyes softened, and in them Jasmine saw not just memory, but resilience, and something fiercer still. Love. Oprah let the moment settle fully between them before answering, her voice wrapped in steel and sorrow. Only for a few seconds, she said, every word deliberate, each syllable a step back into every battle she had survived. Then I remembered, I'm not just living for myself. And in that breath, the whole room seemed to understand that neither were they. The echo of Oprah's vow lingered, threading through the stillness like a current, drawing everyone deeper into a conversation too honest to be escaped and too vital to be ignored. Oprah straightened slightly, her voice slipping into a steadier current, low and deliberate. There was a time, she said, scanning the room slowly, when racism didn't hide. It didn't whisper. It shouted. It sat right in your face and dared you to act like it wasn't there. Her words dropped into the space like stones, heavy and undeniable. Now it's different. It dresses itself up in awards, fancy resumes, and glass offices you can see into, but never get through. A low murmur stirred across the room, raw and restless. Oprah's eyes didn't accuse. They simply revealed, stripping away the polite layers everyone knew too well. It smiles at you in meetings, it applauds your speeches, and then it shuts the real door behind you when you're not looking. Jasmine sat a little straighter, feeling every word land hard and true, and for a heartbeat, no one even shifted in their seats, like the whole room forgot how to breathe. Jasmine leaned in, her voice steady but pulling straight from somewhere deeper. How did you break through that? She asked, her words simple, real, cutting straight to the bone. How did you get past a system built for people who don't look like us? Her eyes stayed locked on Oprah, no anger, just the raw urgency of someone carrying too many hopes in one pair of hands. How did you stand there being you, when everything around you was telling you to change? The room felt smaller suddenly, drawn into the gravity of her question. How did you not just fit in, but change what success was supposed to look like? Her voice cracked just a little at the end, but she didn't pull back. She left the question hanging there, open, waiting, not for a speech, but for something real. Oprah's expression softened. Not pity, but a kind of fierce respect. And the silence between them pulsed with a different kind of power. The kind that builds something new from everything that tried to break you. Oprah let the weight of Jasmine's question settle between them, then drew a slow breath, as if pulling memory from a place deeper than pain, deeper than anger, a place made entirely of survival. Oprah's gaze swept gently over the crowd, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, but carried a quiet fire. Back in the 1980s, she said, if you turned on the TV, almost every face hosting a talk show looked the same. She didn't rush. She let the memory unfold naturally, like reopening a door she had once been told was locked. They were polished, composed, and white. That was the image people were told to trust. She paused, letting the raw simplicity of the truth settle into the air. When I first sat behind that desk, with my brown skin, my full voice, my heart open, I wasn't what they expected. I wasn't what the executives thought audiences wanted to see. Her voice dropped a little lower, more certain. To them, I wasn't safe. I was a risk. And for a long time, a lot of people just waited, thinking I would fail, because the picture they built of success didn't have room for someone like me. She let her hands fall lightly to her sides, a quiet refusal to shrink. But I didn't show up to fit into anyone's picture. I showed up to be real. The room seemed to still even further, as if the very walls leaned closer to hear the next words. Oprah's expression softened, not with nostalgia, but with something fiercer. Pride earned the hard way. And somehow being real was enough. She let the simple truth hang there, powerful in its plainness. The Oprah Winfrey Show didn't just stay on air. It became the highest-rated talk show in television history. A ripple went through the audience, a crack in the held breath of hundreds of people. But no one interrupted. Oprah's voice warmed, stronger now. And I didn't have to change who I was to get there. I didn't have to hide. I didn't have to become someone safer. She paused one final time, and when she spoke again, her words felt like they were stitched directly into the hearts of everyone listening. Sometimes just being yourself in a world that keeps asking you to change is the bravest revolution there is. For a long, stretching second, the room was frozen, caught between the weight of everything she had survived and the breathtaking, simple act of her standing there. And then the applause broke loose, a roar that rolled through the hall like thunder, fierce and unstoppable. People rose to their feet without even thinking, their hands coming together with the force of something bigger than just clapping. It was pride. It was recognition. It was a whole room standing not just for Oprah, but for every battle, every silence broken, every impossible dream that refused to stay buried. As the roar of applause faded into a softer, lingering thunder, there was no sense of relief in the room, only a deeper hunger, a silent understanding that the hardest stories had yet to be told. Oprah took a small step forward, her hand brushing once across her hip, as if steadying herself before opening another door most would rather leave closed. Her voice when it came was quiet but unflinching. Early in my career, she said, I got a job at a TV station in Baltimore. It felt like everything I had worked for was finally falling into place. Her words carried the hope of a younger self still vivid under the surface. But it didn't last long. They called me into an office one afternoon, two executives sitting stiff behind a polished desk. She paused, and the memory seemed to ripple through her bones. They said I wasn't fit for television, that I didn't have the look, that my presence made people uncomfortable. The way she spoke, plain, unadorned, only made the injustice sharper. It didn't matter that I worked twice as hard. It didn't matter that I cared more than most. What mattered was that I didn't fit into the picture they had already framed. A shiver passed through the audience, subtle but real, as if hundreds of shoulders tightened at once. Oprah didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of the truth did all the lifting. I packed up my things and walked out of that building with everything I owned fitting into one box. For one terrible second, I thought maybe they were right. Maybe I really didn't belong anywhere. I sat in my car outside that building, gripping the steering wheel so tight my hands went numb, wondering if I had just watched my whole life close its door. And I promised myself one thing. She let the words hang for a breath, letting the silence carry their gravity. I would never again let someone else tell me how big my life was allowed to be. Her fingers flexed once at her side, almost unconsciously, a flash of defiance not spoken but lived. Across the hall, people leaned in, their faces tense, their hearts caught somewhere between fury and admiration. Jasmine's hands resting on her lap, curled slightly, a mirror of battles too familiar to name. For a few long seconds, no one even shifted in their seats. The room wasn't just listening, it was holding its breath with her. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, catching the moment before it could slip away, and when she spoke, her voice was low but clear. "It's never the loud attacks that hit the hardest," she said, her gaze drifting out across the crowd. "It's the slow cuts, the times you're told, without anyone saying it out loud, that you don't belong unless you bend yourself into something smaller." She swallowed once, visibly, but didn't flinch. "I remember going on national television, speaking out about voter suppression. Her words sharpened with memory, each syllable pressed tight. And after the interview, my phone lit up with people telling me I was too angry, too direct, too black." She let out a soft, almost soundless breath, the kind that came from remembering blows taken in silence. "I wasn't supposed to speak like that on camera. I wasn't supposed to make people uncomfortable." Her hands, still steady in her lap, curled a little tighter, but her voice didn't break. "I was supposed to smile, nod, and make it easier for them to ignore what was happening." The room had gone so still that even the small creaks of the floorboards under shifting feet seemed too loud. Jasmine didn't rush to fill the space. She let the truth breathe, sharp, raw, undeniable. "But I didn't change," she said simply, "and for that, they tried to drown out my voice. But here's what they forgot." Her voice lifted just a little now, steady and sure. Each word carried on a current too deep to silence. "The more they tried to push me down, the stronger the ground grew beneath my feet." She turned slightly toward Oprah, a bridge built from one life to another. "Because every scar we carry isn't proof we lost. It's proof we survived." Her eyes burned, not with tears, but with a fierce, defiant pride. Oprah nodded once, slow and sure, as if sealing the words in the air itself. And then she spoke again, quiet but ringing through the space like a bell in the dark. "Resilience doesn't erase the scars." She let that truth settle like dust in the lungs. "It turns them into badges of honor." For a moment, no one moved. There were no gasps, no shouts, only a slow rising pulse of something heavier, deeper. Then almost all at once, a wave of small but heartfelt applause broke out. Not wild, not showy, quiet, deliberate, the kind of clapping that said, "We see you." Hands came together in a slow, measured rhythm, the sound like rain starting to fall after a long, brutal drought. Across the room, faces tilted downward, not in shame but in reverence. It wasn't pity filling the air. It was recognition. It was gratitude. It was the sacred understanding that the strongest warriors are not the ones who never get hurt. They're the ones who carry their scars like banners and still keep walking forward. The applause faded into a soft undercurrent, but the energy in the room stayed charged, as if everyone knew the conversation was about to shift, from surviving the world as it was to daring to rebuild it from the ground up. Oprah's voice softened, but the fire in it didn't dim. "After years of being told where I could sit, what I could say, and how much space I was allowed to take up," she said, her words deliberate and clear, "I realized I didn't want to wait for someone else to hand me a seat at their table." Her hands opened slightly as if she were laying the truth bare between them. "I wanted to build my own table, my own room, my own rules." She paused, letting the words land, solid and undeniable. "That's why I started Harpo Productions. I wanted to tell stories, my stories, our stories, without asking permission first." A ripple of silent awe ran through the crowd, a wave of understanding not shouted but felt deep in the chest. "Owning the narrative," she said, her voice low but fierce, "meant owning the power to shape the world we live in." Her eyes gleamed under the soft lights, not with pride, but with something deeper, freedom paid for in full. It wasn't about rejecting the old system. It was about refusing to wait another second for it to recognize me. Around her, the air thickened again, heavy with the realization that real change never asks. It builds. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her hands tightening just a little in her lap, her voice threading into the thick, electric silence. "Were you scared?" she asked, the words direct, without polish, as if drawn straight from her chest. "Starting something that big, was there ever a moment you thought it might all fall apart?" Her question didn't come from doubt. It came from somewhere more vulnerable, from the small, silent place inside everyone that wonders if courage will be enough. The room leaned with her, hundreds of faces holding their breath for the answer. Oprah let out a soft, almost private laugh, not mocking but remembering. "Of course I was scared," she said, her smile gentle but edged with iron. "But you know what scared me more?" She looked straight at Jasmine, and through her to everyone listening. Waking up years later and realizing I had let fear steal my life from me. The words cracked something open in the room, a pressure that no one had even realized they were holding in their chests. For a heartbeat, no one even blinked. Jasmine let the truth of that answer settle deep inside her before speaking again. "That's why when I ran for office," she said, her voice growing stronger with every word, "I didn't ask anyone for permission." Her words struck like steady drum beats, small and sure. "I didn't wait for the consultants to tell me what to say. I didn't smooth out my edges to make myself easier to sell." Her eyes lit with a fierce, quiet fire. "I wrote every speech. I chose every word. I made sure every poster, every slogan, every message carried the truth. Not the version of me they thought voters wanted, but the real me." Her hand pressed lightly against the table, as if grounding herself in the memory. "They said it was risky. They said it was reckless." She smiled then, not soft, but proud. "But I decided I'd rather lose being myself than win being someone I didn't recognize." The weight of her words pulled the room tighter around her, every breath held in a quiet, swelling reverence. For a long second, the room stayed frozen, a tightrope of emotion stretched from one corner to the other. And then, like a wave gathering unstoppable force, the applause broke through. It wasn't loud at first. It was sharp, sure, the kind that came from deep in the chest. Hands clapped together in a rising storm, not just for Jasmine's victory, but for the defiant choice to exist on her own terms. Some people stood without realizing it, their chairs scraping back across the floor, pulled to their feet by something too strong to resist. It wasn't just admiration filling the space now. It was something heavier, richer, solidarity. It was the sound of a room choosing not just to believe in change, but to be part of it. The applause slowly ebbed away, but the energy in the room stayed alive, thicker, heavier, as if everyone knew the next words would cut closer, deeper, stripping past victories down to the raw truth beneath them. Oprah leaned in slightly, her hands resting lightly on the table, and when she spoke, her voice was low, but carried like thunder through still air. "You can argue with numbers," she said, her gaze sweeping the crowd, anchoring each listener in place. "You can spin facts. You can twist statistics into knots." She paused, her next words dropping slower, sharper. "But you can't argue with real pain. You can't twist away someone's lived truth." The room tightened, the silence sharpening, stretching over their heads like an invisible wire. Oprah let the weight of it settle fully before she continued, her tone steady, unwavering. "Pain speaks a language that cuts through all the noise. It demands to be seen." Her hands moved once, briefly emphasizing the point not with force, but with finality. "And sometimes," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but felt like a hammer, "that is the only thing strong enough to break walls too high to climb." Every breath in the room felt thinner now, drawn tight with something heavier than sadness. Recognition. Jasmine inhaled slowly, steadying herself before she spoke, her voice threading into the charged silence. "A few years ago," she began, her hands resting open on her lap, "my mother collapsed outside a hospital. She didn't rush. She let every word find its place. She made it inside, barely, but they didn't treat her." A shudder moved invisibly through the crowd, but Jasmine's voice stayed firm. "They said she didn't have the right paperwork, the right insurance, the right anything." Her hands tightened once, then released, like a tide pulling back. She sat there in that waiting room for hours, getting worse, while nurses and doctors walked by like she wasn't even real. The memory burned behind her words, but she didn't flinch. By the time someone helped her, it was almost too late. Her voice dipped lower, each word landing like a stone dropped into a still lake. That day changed more than just her life. It changed mine. For a moment, the room sat suspended, held aloft by the breathlessness of collective grief that wasn't their own, but suddenly felt very close. Jasmine looked down briefly, gathering herself, and then lifted her head higher, her voice hardening, not in anger, but in resolution. "I told that story in front of Congress," she said, each word clear, cut from steel. "I didn't come with charts or polls or policy briefs. I came with the truth." Her fingers tapped lightly against the table, the tiniest of sounds in the vast quiet. And for the first time, the room stopped pretending it didn't understand. She drew a breath, steady and full. That story helped pass legislation to protect patients who can't speak for themselves. It didn't fix everything, but it cracked something that had stayed shut for too long. Her words didn't rise to a shout. They dug deep and stayed there. She turned slightly toward the audience, not to seek approval, but to share something heavier than pride. "Personal stories," she said, her voice almost reverent now, "can rip through walls colder and harder than any argument ever could." The words vibrated in the stillness, sinking into the ribs, the marrow, the bones of everyone listening. For a few long heartbeats, no one moved. Then slowly, quietly, it happened. The soft sound of hands meeting hands, not in applause for performance, but in honor. Heads bowed slightly, eyes glistened without shame. It was not celebration, it was mourning. It was gratitude. It was the shared, aching understanding that sometimes the most powerful weapon you have is simply the truth of your own survival. The quiet honor of the room still lingered, but beneath it, a deeper ache stirred. The pain not from enemies, but from the wounds left by those you thought would stand beside you. Oprah's voice softened, losing none of its power, but carrying an older sadness now, one that lived below the surface of triumph. "When I started to succeed," she said, her hands folding loosely in front of her, "it wasn't just the critics in boardrooms I had to face." She paused. In that breath of stillness, it felt as if 1,000 invisible knives twisted through the air. Some of the harshest voices came from people who looked like me, people who once cheered when I broke through. Her gaze darkened slightly, not from anger, but from a deep, bone-weary knowing. They said I had gone Hollywood, that I wasn't real anymore, that I wasn't black enough to speak for them. The words didn't rise in pitch. They landed soft and devastating, a quiet wrecking ball through the air. It hurt more than anything those networks or executives ever said, because when the people you fight for turn their backs, it cuts deeper than any stranger's knife. She let the silence grow thick around her, letting the truth do its own slow burn through the room. Jasmine shifted forward slightly, her voice steady but low, threading into the heavy quiet like a hand reaching into darkness. "I know that hurt," she said simply, and the simplicity of it made it hit harder. "When I spoke out against injustice, it wasn't just opposition from the other side." Her eyes lowered briefly, then rose again with a steadiness forged in fire. "It was whispers from my own community, people saying I was too loud, too angry." She swallowed but didn't falter. "Some said I wasn't really fighting for them, that I was making it about myself." Her hands curled lightly in her lap, invisible battles playing out in the small tightening of her fingers. Hearing that from people you would bleed for, it carves out a kind of loneliness no victory can fully erase. She paused, letting the sting of it settle naturally into the air between them. "But you learn," she said, her voice hardening just enough to hold steady, "that standing alone in the truth is better than belonging to a lie." Oprah turned slightly toward her, the two women locked in a silent bond thicker than blood, deeper than agreement. It was the shared scar tissue of survival. Together, almost as one voice, they said it, not loudly, but with a clarity that cracked the silence wide open. "Real light always makes the shadows run." For a few long heartbeats, the room didn't move. Heads bowed slightly, eyes glistened. No one cheered, No one clapped. Instead, there was a slow, collective exhale, a sound closer to prayer than applause. Across the hall, grown men blinked back tears they didn't bother hiding. Women pressed their hands to their hearts as if steadying something that might break open. It wasn't a moment of sadness. It was something holier. It was the deep, wordless acknowledgement that sometimes the greatest fight isn't against the enemy outside. It's holding fast when the people you love ask you to sit down, and you rise anyway. The room sat heavy with the weight of shared wounds. But under the sorrow, a new current began to stir. One not of grief, but of fierce, urgent determination. Oprah straightened slowly, the slight shift of her body changing the very air around her, as if bracing for a moment that might split the ground beneath their feet. Her voice, when it came, was low but carried with it the quiet force of a rising storm. "It's not enough," she said, her eyes sweeping across every face, "to survive what was built to break us." The words landed heavy, real, undeniable. It's not enough to just endure another system designed to shut us out one more time. She paused, and the silence around her bristled, electric with expectation. We have to build something better, something they can't touch, can't twist, can't erase. Her hands opened slightly as if planting a seed into the space between them all. That's why today, I'm proposing we launch the Rewrite the Future Foundation. A low gasp moved through the crowd, not loud but sharp, like the first crack of lightning before a summer storm. Oprah's gaze held steady, brighter now, brighter than anger, brighter than fear. Not just to fight injustice, but to outgrow it, to outbuild it, to teach the next generation that they don't have to wait for a seat. They can design the whole damn house. She let the silence settle, not out of hesitation, but to let the enormity of the idea take root. Her voice dropped lower, and somehow it pulled everyone closer. Imagine scholarships that don't just reward those who play by the old rules, but lift up those rewriting them. She moved her hand across the table slowly, as if sketching a blueprint none of them could see yet, but all of them could feel. Imagine funding programs that teach kids not just to dream, but to own their dreams, to protect them, to build futures no one can auction off or tear down. The room shifted again, a collective leaning forward, hearts and minds drawn toward the flame of possibility. Oprah's voice deepened, each word hammering against the past that had tried so hard to cage them. We are not just rewriting stories, we are rewriting what's possible. She paused then, letting the truth hum through the bones of every person sitting there. Rewrite the future isn't about asking permission. It's about making sure no one ever has to ask again. The room vibrated with the energy of a dream too long deferred, and for the first time, it felt like the future wasn't just an idea. It was a door, wide open, daring someone to step through. Jasmine rose from her seat with a quiet certainty, the fabric of her jacket whispering against the chair as she stood. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. The room leaned into her as if it already knew that the next words would be written somewhere permanent, somewhere lasting. She placed her hands firmly on the edge of the table, grounding herself not just in the moment, but in the generations watching through her. When she spoke, her voice was low, steady, the kind of sound that doesn't need to shout to cut through steel. "We can't wait for permission to matter anymore," she said, her gaze moving deliberately across every face, not asking for belief, commanding it. "I will go to Congress. I will fight for a bill that locks federal funding into the future of our HBCUs, not as favors, not as footnotes, but as a foundation." She inhaled slowly, the weight of history coiling around her spine and making her stand taller. "Our schools built leaders when the world wouldn't even call us citizens. They built doctors, judges, presidents, without applause, without backup." Her fingers pressed harder into the table, and the room felt the tremor of it. "It's time we built something that honors what they gave us and protects what's still to come." For a breathless moment, no one moved. Jasmine's chest rose and fell with slow deliberation, her next words carrying not just her own weight, but the silent, aching hopes of thousands. "I won't lobby politely and accept a watered-down compromise," she continued, each word sharpening like a blade. I will stand until it is written, signed, and sealed that our future will no longer depend on charity. Her voice cracked slightly, not from weakness, but from the sheer force of belief behind it, and the room leaned closer. We deserve schools that don't have to patch leaking ceilings while dreaming of changing the world. We deserve more than survival. We deserve strength. She turned her body fully toward the crowd now, offering herself not as a leader perched above them, but as one of them, forged from the same fire. And if it takes every breath I have left, she said, I will see it done. The walls of the hall seemed to pulse with her words, each syllable laying stone after stone on a road none of them were willing to turn away from now. Oprah moved beside her, silent but unshakable, and Jasmine met her eyes with a nod that carried years of unspoken battles behind it. Together, standing shoulder to shoulder, they spoke, not with the theatrics of a rally, but with the sacred weight of a covenant. We are not here to build monuments to ourselves. We are here to build roads for those who will come after us. The words didn't fall like applause lines. They fell like vows, ancient and binding. For a heartbeat, the world outside that room ceased to exist. Then slowly at first, almost timidly, the first hands came together. One clap, two, hesitant, almost reverent. But the hesitation didn't last. It cracked open into a storm. People surged to their feet, chairs scraping against the floor like the sound of walls falling down. Applause roared through the hall, not polished or polite, but raw and uneven. A storm born from every scar they had carried silently until this moment. Some clapped with their hands high above their heads. Some simply pressed a hand over their chest, feeling the drumbeat of belonging pounding against their ribs. Tears streamed openly down faces that didn't bother to hide anymore. It wasn't just celebration. It wasn't just agreement. It was a collective uprising of hope. Louder, fiercer, more unstoppable than anything any of them had ever dared to imagine. The thunder of applause still echoed against the high ceilings, but somewhere beneath it, a softer vibration began to stir, a trembling of hearts on the edge of something they hadn't dared believe could be real, a dream made flesh. Oprah turned slightly, her profile caught in the low golden light, the lines of her face not worn, but carved, each a testament to battles survived, dreams stubbornly kept alive. She didn't raise her voice to meet the roaring crowd. Instead, she let it fall into a hush, so quiet that it pulled the entire room back toward her, like a tide retreating before a wave. She leaned closer to the microphone, but spoke as if it wasn't even there, as if she were whispering directly into the soul of every person watching. Become the person you once wished had been there for you, she said, her voice low, her words falling like stones into a still lake. The simplicity of it was devastating. It stripped away politics, ambition, applause. It reached back through years of loneliness, through rooms where no one came to save you, through silent prayers spoken by children too small to understand what they were asking for. The moment cracked open, raw and holy, the kind of silence where you could hear the walls breathing. Jasmine stood frozen for a second, her throat working against the sudden swell of feeling that rose too fast, too fierce to control. She blinked hard, but the tears escaped anyway, catching the sharp lights overhead and turning them into stars that blurred her vision. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, not from weakness, but from the weight of standing face to face with a wish she had carried so long it had almost become myth. She opened her mouth once, closed it, then finally found the strength to lift her eyes to Oprah's. When she spoke, her voice cracked wide open, and she didn't care who saw. You are that person for me, she whispered, the words tumbling out, raw, unpolished, more real than anything she had ever said in her life. You were the light I couldn't find, the voice that said, survive anyway, dream anyway. Jasmine's chest heaved with the effort of saying it out loud, but she didn't look away. She needed Oprah to see it. She needed every scar she carried to be witnessed and honored. And Oprah, standing steady in front of her, received it all without flinching. For a heartbeat, neither woman moved. Then Oprah opened her arms, simple, unforced, and Jasmine stepped into them without hesitation, the way a child steps into shelter after too many storms. The embrace wasn't polite. It wasn't staged. It was fierce, trembling with everything words could never fully capture. The long, brutal ache of dreams deferred, the deep, stubborn love that survived anyway. Jasmine buried her face into Oprah's shoulder, and for a moment, the whole room seemed to lean forward, holding its breath. This wasn't history made on a grand stage. This was history made in the breaking and mending of a human heart. Oprah closed her arms tighter around Jasmine, resting her cheek briefly atop the younger woman's head. And when she closed her eyes, it was as if she gathered every lost girl, every silenced voice, every battered dream into that one impossible embrace. The sound that broke over the room next wasn't applause. Not yet. It was the sound of 100, 200, 500 people gasping quietly, a wave of breath sucked in all at once. Some clutched at their chests, some pressed their hands over their mouths. Tears streamed freely down faces old and young, black and brown and white. Not because of pain, but because for once the distance between survival and triumph had collapsed into nothing but the space of two arms wrapped around each other. The walls seemed to blur. The lights shimmered. Jasmine and Oprah stood in the center of it all, two flames braided together, refusing to be extinguished. Around them, history rewrote itself, not with headlines or signatures, but with the beating hearts of a people who understood, viscerally, what it meant to be seen and chosen and carried forward. Then slowly the applause began again, not wild but swelling, gathering force like an ocean tide. People rose to their feet in waves, the sound growing, roaring, filling every corner of the room and crashing against the walls like thunder. Some people clapped through tears that blurred the room into light and shadow. Others simply pressed their hands together at their hearts, as if praying with their whole bodies. It wasn't just admiration rising from the floorboards. It was relief. It was gratitude. It was generations' worth of longing given form at last. The clapping grew louder, faster, desperate almost, not to celebrate the victory of two women, but to hold on to the fleeting, shattering beauty of what they had just witnessed. Jasmine finally stepped back, wiping at her face with a laugh that cracked into a sob halfway through. Oprah smiled, a slow, radiant thing that seemed to light her from the inside, and reached out to brush Jasmine's cheek lightly with her fingers, a benediction and a blessing. They didn't need to say anything more. The moment had already said it all. This is what it looks like when survival becomes legacy, and the crowd standing shoulder to shoulder, hands raw from clapping, eyes wet and shining, knew they had seen something that didn't happen often enough in this world. Not just power, not just history, but hope, made real, made flesh, made unstoppable. As Jasmine and Oprah stepped back from their embrace, the electricity they had sparked didn't fade. It spread, moving like wildfire through every heart in the room and beyond its walls, faster than anyone could have prepared for. Somewhere in the thick of the applause, a camera flash caught them. The moment Oprah and Jasmine's hands clasped under the still falling stage lights, two generations of fight and hope welded into a single blinding image. The photo didn't just capture a gesture, it captured a revolution, suspended in a single heartbeat. Within minutes, the image hit the first news feed, first local, then national. Within hours, it was everywhere, carried like a spark on dry wind across a country aching for something real to believe in. Television anchors paused mid-broadcast to flash it across their screens. Journalists who had spent weeks chasing scandals dropped everything to write about a handshake. It wasn't the composition that mattered or the lighting. It was the weight of it, the defiance, the unity, the unspoken promise that this time, maybe history wouldn't be forgotten 5 minutes later. The photo wasn't staged. It didn't need to be. It was truth in its purest, most dangerous form. And America, whether it was ready or not, saw it. By nightfall, the image had been shared millions of times. It appeared on Instagram stories, framed by trembling hands, on TikTok videos stitched into testimonies from kids who had never before felt brave enough to speak, on Twitter threads filled with fire and raw memory. Someone somewhere, no one knew who, coined the hashtag #rewrite the future. And like dry timber snapping into flame, the words caught. They leapt from post to post, from city to city, a code, a prayer, a dare written in neon ink across the digital sky. It wasn't just a hashtag, it was a rallying cry. It moved faster than algorithms could cage it, faster than trolls could smear it. It was whispered between kids crammed into bus stops and shouted by teens pacing back and forth, in bedrooms wallpapered with secondhand dreams. It scrawled itself in sidewalk chalk across campuses. It lit up handmade posters taped to windows in neighborhoods that had been written off and forgotten. In a country used to short attention spans and disposable outrage, something different was happening. Rewrite the future wasn't a trend, it was an ignition. In Detroit, a 17-year-old girl stood trembling in front of a packed gymnasium, a borrowed microphone shaking in her hand, telling the story of how her brother had been expelled from school for speaking out against racist teachers. In Birmingham, a young man posted a video that went viral overnight, his voice cracking as he described how his mother still worked two jobs because her degree from an HBCU didn't open the same doors. In Los Angeles, a kid no one had ever heard of posted a single sentence. They told me I was too loud to matter, but today my story matters too. And somehow, that one line was shared over 1 million times in less than a day. Stories poured out like water breaking through a dam that had held for too long. Stories that had been kept small out of fear. Stories that had been folded into polite corners, hidden from sight. Now they flooded the streets. They flooded the timelines. They flooded the country with a raw, breathtaking humanity that no pundit, no politician, no hate group could twist back into silence. And at the center of the storm stood that single, unbreakable image. Oprah and Jasmine, standing hand in hand, looking out at the world not with anger, but with relentless, merciful courage. News networks tried to catch up. They scrambled to book interviews with the kids telling their truths. Talk shows scrambled to adjust their scripts to cover the movement without sounding like they had missed the entire point. Celebrities tweeted in support, but for once it wasn't their voices that mattered most. It was the ones who had never been given a microphone before, the ones whose pain had been background noise until someone finally dared to call it music. In every corner of the country, something ancient and fragile and furious began to pulse. A knowing that the future wasn't just something that happened, it was something you wrote, line by bloody line, story by defiant story. Jasmine watched it all unfold from a small hotel room hours after the event ended, still in the same clothes, her hair mussed, her makeup worn away by tears and time. She scrolled through the posts with trembling hands, heart pounding, with something that wasn't quite fear and wasn't quite hope, but something bigger, something she didn't yet have a name for. Beside her, Oprah sat quietly, her phone untouched on the nightstand, her gaze soft but fierce. They didn't say much. They didn't need to. The roar of a new generation rising was loud enough to fill the silence between them. Jasmine's throat tightened as she scrolled past a video of a boy, couldn't be more than 12, standing on a cracked playground and shouting into a cheap phone camera. I matter, I matter, I matter. 3 words, a revolution. Oprah reached out, laying a hand lightly over Jasmine's. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a warning. It was a reminder. This is what happens when you dare to hold the line long enough for someone else to step through. Outside, the city lights blinked against the darkness, a Morse code of possibilities. Somewhere across the streets and screens, another kid was picking up their phone, finding the courage to say, maybe for the first time, this is my story too. And the future, the real future, the one no one could unwrite now, shuddered into motion, fierce and unstoppable. The morning after the photo went viral, the country woke up different. Not louder, not flashier, just heavier, like the ground itself had absorbed a new weight. The usual noise of the news cycle, celebrity gossip, political backbiting, endless commercials, seemed to hush for once, pushed aside by something bigger that no one could quite name yet. Cities stirred awake slower, like people were sensing something sacred had cracked open and weren't sure yet how to step into it. Street vendors, setting up their stalls in Chicago, paused to watch a clip of Jasmine and Oprah on their phones, their fingers hovering over touchscreen screens, momentarily forgetting their tasks. In Harlem, an old man sweeping the sidewalk outside a barber shop wiped his hands on his apron and muttered under his breath, "Took long enough." No breaking news alert captured it. No anchor framed it with scripted gravitas. It wasn't a headline. It was a shift in the bones of a country that had too often pretended it had no ghosts. In schools, the ripple was sharper, faster. By mid-morning, teachers found their classes unusually restless, not with disruption, but with a buzzing undercurrent they couldn't quite place. Students who had never spoken much raised their hands. Girls who had always kept their heads down looked teachers in the eye. In one history class in Baltimore, a sophomore named Angelique stood up unprompted and asked why their curriculum didn't cover any leaders who looked like her outside of February. In a civics class in Birmingham, a boy who barely scraped by in grades delivered a trembling but defiant mini-speech about rewriting voter suppression laws. No one had assigned these moments. No one had graded them. And yet across the country, a silent march began. Through corridors lined with faded flags, through metal detectors humming at the entrances, through tired fluorescent-lit halls. These weren't protests, not yet. They were declarations, quiet and unstoppable. We are still here. We are still rising. And we refuse to stay invisible. By the afternoon, community centers that had sat half-empty for years found themselves flooded. In Detroit, a library basement intended for a dozen teens overflowed with 80, their voices crashing against each other, loud, clumsy, hungry. Some had notebooks clenched in their hands, pages filled with hastily scribbled poems, demands, dreams. Some just brought their raw selves, battered and brilliant, demanding a space to be seen. Elders showed up too, grandmothers carrying folding chairs and stories too heavy for one lifetime. They didn't come to scold or manage. They came to bear witness, to offer nods and worn hands pressed against young shoulders, passing down something older than speeches: endurance. In Atlanta, an open mic scheduled for 20 kids stretched past midnight, every chair filled, kids standing shoulder to shoulder against the walls, waiting not just for their turn to speak, but for their turn to exist out loud. The march wasn't organized. It wasn't polished. There were no polished banners, no sponsorships, no camera-ready slogans. There were kids on bicycles passing flyers printed on borrowed copy machines. There were teenagers chalking "Need to rewrite the future" on cracked sidewalks in neighborhoods too many politicians had promised and abandoned. There were young women carving the words into the margins of their textbooks during math class, boys scratching it onto the backs of cafeteria trays, graffiti artists spraying it onto the brick skeletons of abandoned malls. Every place America had forgotten became a canvas. Every voice it had tried to silence became an anthem. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. It was reclamation of spaces, of names, of futures wrestled back from hands that had held them hostage too long. Social media, always restless, bent under the weight of it. At first, journalists tried to explain it away, calling it youth activism like it was something tidy, manageable. Then the hashtags flooded faster than they could file their reports. Stories piled on stories, videos stitched to videos. Thousands of young faces speaking not to politicians, but to each other. One post from a girl in Jackson, Mississippi, went viral within hours. They told us history was written by the victors, so we're writing ours in real time. It wasn't crafted for attention. It wasn't slick or sound-bitten. That was why it caught fire. Because it was true. Because it was unfinished. Because it belonged to everyone who read it and felt their own lungs expand wider than the cages built around them. In towns where graduation rates hovered just above despair, valedictorians used their moment on stage to speak not of scholarships, but of injustice. In cities where gunfire too often sang the night to sleep, teenagers marched, not with polished chants, but with the broken hymns of lives snatched too soon. They marched past boarded-up factories, past churches turned into dollar stores, past empty lots that once dreamed of parks. They marched with their heads high, their fists low, but their stories lit like torches inside them. Not demanding to be saved, demanding to be seen, demanding that the world stop rewriting their futures without them at the table. Somewhere in New Orleans, a boy with a skateboard slung over his shoulder scrawled the hashtag across the hood of a broken-down car, abandoned on a street corner. In Oakland, a group of teens spray-painted a basketball court wall overnight with the names of Black writers, artists, dreamers who had built legacies with nothing but paper and rage. In Miami, a shy 12-year-old recorded herself reading a letter to her future self and posted it online, her voice shaking so hard she almost couldn't get the words out. Don't give up, even when they act like you were never meant to be here. Especially then. It racked up 3 million views in a week. Not because she was famous, but because she was fearless in a way fame could never teach. There were mistakes, of course, missteps, anger spilling over into shouting matches, old wounds flaring hot between communities who had more in common than they realized. But the movement didn't shatter. It grew. It grew because it wasn't built on personalities. It wasn't built on polished leaders or viral campaigns. It was built on the simple, savage need to be heard, to be counted, to be impossible to erase. It was built, ironically, the way all true revolutions are built, messily, painfully, beautifully, in the hands of the ones the world had counted out too soon. And through it all, the image of Oprah and Jasmine, hand in hand under a single beam of light, floated above it like a North Star. Not because they were perfect, not because they had promised easy victories, but because they had shown that survival could be welded into hope, and that hope could be turned into fuel. In interviews, Jasmine refused to claim the spotlight, pushing instead for the focus to stay on the movement itself. Oprah, when asked, simply smiled and said, "The story was never about us. It was always about what comes next. What came next wasn't a moment. It wasn't even a movement. It was a march, silent, relentless, unstoppable, step by step, breath by breath, toward a future that, for the first time in too long, belonged to those who dared to write it themselves. The steps of the Capitol had seen history before. Protests, speeches, broken promises echoing into marble halls. But that morning the air tasted different. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't blind hope. It was the sharp, metallic taste of something raw being forged, not behind closed doors, but right there in the open, under the hard glare of a rising sun. Jasmine stood at the top of the steps, a folded document clutched in one hand, her other hand trembling slightly at her side. She wasn't wearing a designer suit. She wasn't flanked by handlers. Just her and a circle of supporters, young, old, worn, fierce, crowding behind her like a living wall. Her heart pounded against her ribs, not from fear, but from the sacred weight of what she carried. A draft of the new bill that would fund HBCUs not as charity, but as birthright. She looked down once at the heavy streets below, the world waking up slowly, unaware, or maybe unwilling, to realize it was about to be rewritten. Jasmine didn't need them to know. She needed only to hold the line. She raised the paper high above her head, the morning sun slicing through it like a blade through smoke. For a breathless second, everything stopped. The murmuring crowd fell silent. Even the stiff spring breeze seemed to still. Then a voice rang out from somewhere in the crowd. Not a chant, not a slogan, but a single sharp cry. "Rewrite it, Jasmine!" And just like that, the air cracked open. The small group of witnesses erupted in cheers that shattered the stillness, that slapped against the hard stone buildings and bounced back again, louder. Jasmine felt it surge up through her feet, through her spine, through the hand that gripped the bill tighter than she realized. She knew this was only the beginning. She knew there would be hearings, backlash, ugly headlines waiting for her in tomorrow's papers, but she also knew something even truer. Beginnings were meant to be messy. Progress was supposed to be loud, unruly, bloodied. No one had ever won the future by asking for it nicely. Jasmine pressed the folded bill against her chest for a heartbeat, a silent vow stitched under her skin. Behind her, the crowd wasn't clapping for a piece of paper. They were clapping for every broken promise it dared to challenge. As she took her first step down the stairs, leading them forward, the sun climbed higher over the Capitol dome, casting her shadow long and dark and unbroken across the stone. It wasn't a march of thousands yet. It wasn't a law yet. But it was a promise, burning bright in a city built to extinguish it. And this time, the fire was just getting started. As Jasmine disappeared into the swelling tide of voices, one truth rose unshakable from the roar. This was no ending. It was a beginning carved in fire. The story wasn't about winning a single battle. It was about refusing to vanish. Jasmine and Oprah showed that survival is its own revolution, and that every scar carried forward is a weapon, not a wound. They proved that change isn't given, it's taken, carved out with raw hands and untamed hope. Against a world built to erase them, they didn't bow. They built new roads. They rewrote the rules. And through them, every quiet voice now knows, you don't have to ask permission to exist. You just have to stand, speak, and burn bright enough that no one can look away. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. In the middle of a live congressional hearing, Caroline Leavitt looked Jasmine Crockett straight in the eye and shouted, "Go back to Africa!" The entire room froze. The cameras rolled, and America witnessed one woman unleash her fury, while the other answered with history. With nothing but her voice and her truth, Jasmine shattered decades of denial within the marble halls of power. How could an insult meant to silence one woman end up shaking an entire nation to its core? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C. wasn't a room anymore. It was a trap, spring-loaded and ticking down. Cold lights bore down from the ceiling, flattening every line on every face into something harsh, exposed. Cameras crouched along the walls like mechanical predators, their lenses wide open, waiting for blood. A low murmur vibrated through the air, not conversation, just tension bleeding out of human skin. The heavy oak table stretched like a battlefield between two women who could not have stood for more different Americas. Jasmine Crockett sat at one end, her spine straight, her hands still, every inch of her screaming, "I am not here to apologize." Across from her, Caroline Leavitt adjusted her papers, sharp, jerky motions, her polished smile already cracking at the edges. Around them, aides moved stiffly, the scratch of pen on paper too loud, the shuffle of a chair unbearable. Every breath taken in that room felt rationed, careful, loaded with the knowledge that one wrong word would ignite the whole thing. Jasmine wasn't here for herself alone. She was carrying the gravity of stories never told, verdicts never overturned, names never cleared. She could feel them behind her, like a wall, ancestors in shackles, mothers in courtrooms clutching crumpled subpoenas, boys shot for walking wrong on the wrong street. She didn't need to be told the room wasn't made for her voice. The walls themselves whispered it. Caroline knew it too, and that knowledge flickered behind her eyes like a silent alarm she refused to acknowledge. Today's hearing was supposed to be about judicial reform, but everyone in that room could feel the truth pressing down harder. It was about belonging, about who was allowed to claim America as theirs without qualification. The chairman's gavel slammed down, a crack that sounded too much like a rifle shot, and the room jolted as if the floor had shifted. Jasmine inhaled once, slow and deep, steadying the roar in her blood. Caroline's hand tightened slightly on her pen, the movement small but unmistakable. The war had already started, and not a single word had been spoken yet. The air tightened so much that even the silence seemed to vibrate. Every heartbeat in the room beating in step with an invisible clock, counting down to the moment everything would break. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slightly, the tiny movement magnified 100 times by the tension crackling across the room. Her voice was calm, but cut clean through the heavy silence, like the first crack of thunder before a storm breaks. She wasn't reading. The facts were alive inside her, carved into years of cases she had fought, stories she had carried. In majority black districts, she said, her voice low but unwavering, sentences are on average 34% harsher compared to white districts, even when the crime is the same. No one interrupted. No one dared. Jasmine didn't flood them with statistics. She laid them out one by one, each fact dropped carefully, like laying bricks for a house the room was being forced to live inside. In states like Louisiana and Mississippi, defendants of color are twice as likely to be wrongfully convicted compared to white defendants. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. The weight of what she was saying pressed harder with every word, each syllable sinking deeper into the foundation of the hearing. Every chair creaked slightly as people adjusted, not from boredom, but because sitting still under that kind of truth started to feel unbearable. Jasmine kept her gaze steady, scanning the room, daring anyone to look away from the reality she was building in front of them. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't asking. She was testifying. She pointed out that federal reviews had documented patterns year after year, showing how communities of color received harsher treatment at every level, from arrest to conviction to sentencing. And she did it without a single tremor in her voice. It wasn't anger speaking. It was exhaustion. It was experience. It was the knowledge that facts alone had never been enough to make some people care. But that didn't mean you stopped speaking them out loud. She turned a page on her folder slowly, the sound sharp in the silence. Bias is not a ghost, she said. It has fingerprints, names, faces. A few aides scribbled notes, pretending the words weren't cutting through their composure. The weight in the room built so thick you could feel it sinking into your chest. Then, just when Jasmine opened her mouth to continue, the interruption came, hard, fast, and sharp enough to feel like a slap. Caroline Levitt leaned forward too, her voice cold, flat, weaponized. Maybe you should study your African roots before trying to teach Americans how our laws work, Caroline said, the words slipping out, smooth and deliberate. Not a misstep, not a stutter. The room didn't just fall silent, it froze. It was the kind of silence that felt physical, heavy, like the air itself had been punched out of the room. For a moment, everything stopped. Jasmine, mid-breath, stared across the table, her hands still folded neatly in front of her. Not a flicker of shock, not an outburst. Just a deep, cutting awareness that everyone else was now being forced to feel too. Heads turned, eyes widened. A camera zoomed in silently, catching every tightening jaw, every slow blink. Somewhere near the back, an older black staffer shifted in his seat, his hand gripping the armrest tight, knuckles whitening. Near the press bench, a young reporter's pen hovered midair, forgotten. The words sat there, thick and sour, too real to be taken back, too loud to pretend not to hear. Nobody moved, nobody dared. In that frozen second, all the old rules people used to politely ignore racism, plausible deniability, coded language, backhanded compliments, were useless. The insult was out there now, raw and naked under the lights, and there would be no pretending it hadn't happened. Jasmine Crockett didn't blink. She didn't lean back. She didn't lash out. She simply tilted her head slightly, a gesture so small yet so cutting it made the tension even heavier. Her voice came out low and calm, not soft, but sharpened to a deadly edge. "Would you mind repeating that?" she asked, each word measured, cool, deliberate. It wasn't a question born from confusion. It was a challenge, a dare, laid out in front of everyone, like a loaded weapon placed gently on the table. The kind of question that demanded an answer, so that no one could pretend they hadn't heard it the first time. For a long second, Caroline didn't move. But then, pride pushed her forward, like a hand between her shoulder blades. Caroline Levitt pushed herself up from her chair, the legs scraping loud and ugly against the polished floor. She didn't hesitate. Her face didn't flinch. She lifted her chin and threw the words out into the room, with all the brittle force of someone who had never been made to carry the weight of what she said. "If you think America is so unjust," Caroline declared, voice rising loud and clear over the stunned room, "then maybe you should go back to Africa." The sentence hit the room like a metal door slamming shut. People jerked in their seats. Some froze, halfway through scribbling notes, pens hovering uselessly above paper. A cameraman near the back sucked in a sharp breath, loud enough to be heard. The words weren't a mistake. They weren't a slip. They were a weapon, aimed and fired, with the steady hand of someone who believed there would be no consequences. The microphones caught everything. No static, no distortion, no chance for spin. The broadcast feed didn't blink. Across America, in living rooms, on phones, in busy cafes, millions of people heard it in real time, raw, naked, undeniable. In the hearing room, the air turned poisonous, heavy enough to make lungs ache. Some people sat stunned, staring at Caroline as if she had pulled a mask off and revealed something uglier underneath. Others chuckled under their breath, a low, smug sound that sounded like doors slamming shut in someone's face. One congressman in the back corner shook his head slowly, lips pressed into a thin line of disgust, while a woman 2 rows down muttered a prayer into her clenched fists. Across the committee table, a young black aide swallowed hard, his hands trembling slightly against his notepad. Not from fear, but from rage so old it didn't even feel sharp anymore. Just heavy, like iron chains looped around the ribs. Jasmine saw it all, the gasps, the smirks, the tightening hands, and she sat still, absorbing it, letting the truth of the moment settle into the bones of the room. She knew this wasn't new. It was only louder now, broadcasted, played in real time. This was the America she had grown up learning to navigate, with precision, with armor invisible but heavy, and now the whole country was watching, not just what had been said, but what she would do next. Jasmine moved forward, each step heavy with meaning, her heels tapping against the marble like a slow, steady drumbeat, announcing a shift that everyone could feel, but no one could stop. She didn't rush. She didn't speak right away. The silence itself seemed to lean toward her, hungry for what was about to come. The bright lights overhead caught the sharp lines of her dark blue suit, the gleam of the small silver cross at her collar, the set of her jaw, carved from pure will. Cameras followed her automatically, but no one needed the lens to tell them where the center of gravity had shifted. She stopped at the heart of the room, not behind a desk, not shielded by papers or protocol. Just standing there, herself alone, every inch of her rooted like a monument that would not move. She raised the microphone slowly, not for show, but with the patience of someone who knew that, when the truth is ready, it does not need to shout. Her voice, when it finally came, was deeper than anyone expected, steady and slow, and it filled every crack in the room. "I was born in Texas," she said, and the words fell like the first heavy drops of a storm breaking a long drought. "My father wore an American military uniform." She let that sink in, giving no one a place to hide. "My mother wore a nurse's badge." Her voice didn't tremble. It carved its way forward, quiet but unstoppable. "And my ancestors?" She paused, long enough to force every head to lift, every eye to meet hers. "They wore iron shackles." She didn't say it like a plea. She didn't say it for pity. She said it like a fact, too big, too old, and too terrible to be anything but carried. They were chained, packed into ships like cargo, stolen across oceans, and forced to build the very foundation of the country we now sit in. There was no sound but the faint hum of the cameras, the scrape of someone shifting uncomfortably in the far corner. Jasmine's gaze swept the room, slow and unblinking, her silence daring anyone to flinch. Her voice grew quieter but heavier, each word weighted like a stone placed carefully onto the chest of every person listening. "You tell me to go back to Africa?" Her tone colder now, the edges sharpened by a history too often ignored. "My blood, my family's blood, is soaked into this soil deeper than any flag planted hereafter." She took one half step closer, not toward Caroline, but toward every hollow excuse hiding in the room. "I don't need to go anywhere." Her voice cut the air cleanly, like a blade drawn without hesitation. "My family paid for this land with chains, with sweat, with bone, with lives. We built it, we bled for it, and I will not be told to leave it by someone who inherited it without ever having to fight for it." In that moment, Jasmine Crockett didn't just answer an insult. She dismantled it, piece by brutal piece, until there was nothing left for it to stand on. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Not yet. And the stillness in the room grew heavier as she reached slowly for the folder lying on the desk beside her, as if preparing to pull a final blade from its sheath. Jasmine's hand moved with a slow, deliberate precision that made the room feel even tighter, like a wire being pulled closer to the breaking point. She picked up a thick black folder, the bold stamp across its cover practically burning under the harsh lights. Confidential, Internal DOJ Compliance Report, 2019. There was no drama in the way she handled it, no theatrical flourish, only a grim certainty that made the silence sharpen. She opened it carefully, the faint sound of paper shifting somehow louder than any voice in that moment. Every set of eyes followed her hands now, wide, wary, as if bracing for something they could no longer pretend wasn't coming. Jasmine didn't look down at the documents as if discovering them for the first time. She handled them like an old wound, familiar but still raw. Holding up a page, she let the weight of the silence stretch until it hurt, then spoke, voice low and exact. This report was prepared during the time Caroline Leavitt held a position at the Department of Justice. The words hit harder than any shouted accusation. Jasmine didn't pause to savor the reaction. She pressed forward, her tone steady and merciless. Specifically, during her assignment shaping communication strategies and internal policy messaging related to judicial outcomes. She didn't need to raise her voice. The facts were heavy enough to do the crushing for her. Across the long oak table, Caroline's posture stiffened, her fingers twitching slightly where they gripped the armrests of her chair. In the gallery, journalists leaned forward in unison, pens forgotten, screens glowing, the click of cameras replaced by an almost reverent silence. Jasmine let the weight of the open file settle between them, and when she spoke again, it was not with anger, but with the cold, methodical finality of a judge delivering a sentence that could not be appealed. She lifted the first page slowly, the paper crackling slightly in the still air, and began to read, without embellishment, without hesitation. According to this DOJ compliance report, her voice cut through the silence like a slow-moving blade, African Americans received prison sentences 34% longer than white defendants convicted of identical crimes. She didn't look up. She didn't need to. The number itself slammed into the room like a sledgehammer against old, cracking walls. A faint rustle moved through the audience, a few stiff movements from aides trying too hard not to react. But Jasmine pressed on, her cadence even, as if each word had been measured and weighed before being allowed to leave her mouth. She turned the page with deliberate care, the sound scraping across the tension like a knife against bone. Wrongful prosecutions, she continued, her voice growing colder, more precise, occurred at double the rate in neighborhoods predominantly made up of Black and Latino residents compared to predominantly white neighborhoods. Every fact hit harder than the last, not shouted, not dramatized, delivered flat, mercilessly, the way truth demands. Jasmine paused, letting the information hang, heavy and undeniable. Then she reached for another sheet, her fingers steady, her face carved from stone. Internal communications reveal, she said, explicit acknowledgement that external political pressure pushed for intensified law enforcement actions specifically within minority communities. Her tone stayed dry, but the air in the room had changed, thicker, heavier, like the moment before a dam breaks. She turned another page without a glance up, each movement reinforcing that what she carried wasn't accusation, it was evidence. The objective, she read, her voice barely louder than a breath yet somehow filling the entire space, was to maintain public confidence among key voter demographics by showing a tough stance disproportionately at the expense of communities of color. Jasmine closed the folder softly, the finality of the gesture louder than any gavel strike could have been. She stood there a moment longer, the document resting against her side, like a quiet weapon she no longer needed to brandish. Her gaze lifted then, slow and unflinching, sweeping the faces lined up before her. Some lawmakers looked away instantly, their eyes falling to papers, to phones, to the floor. Anywhere but at the woman who had just laid bare what they had spent years pretending was too complicated to fix. Others sat frozen, caught between shame and fear, their carefully rehearsed public faces slipping under the weight of exposed reality. Even the political allies of Caroline Leavitt, who moments ago had laughed or scoffed, now stared hard at the table in front of them, as if the grains of wood could offer them an escape from their own complicity. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't lean forward. She didn't need to. Every word she had spoken still hung there, heavy and sharp, a series of blades suspended over the heads of those who thought history could be rewritten by volume alone. In that moment, the hearing room didn't feel like a place for debate anymore. It felt like a courtroom, and Jasmine Crockett, standing in the center, had become something far more powerful than a witness. She had become the living proof of every truth they had tried to deny. The silence after Jasmine's last document snapped shut was thick and suffocating, the kind that didn't invite a response, but demanded an answer none of them were prepared to give. Jasmine didn't back away. She didn't soften her voice. She let the silence stretch until it became unbearable, until the weight of it forced every head to lift and every face to turn toward her. Then she spoke, her words slow, clean, and heavy enough to leave marks. "You tell me I should leave?" Jasmine said, her voice calm but slicing through the air like a knife through taut rope. She let the question hang, daring it to settle into the lungs of everyone who had laughed, everyone who had looked away. Her eyes never wavered, steady as a blade drawn for judgment. "Maybe," she continued, her tone sharpening, each syllable deliberate, "you should spend more time reading about the crimes you helped cover up." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words were heavier because she delivered them without heat, without noise. Only with the cold precision of someone who carried generations of silence turned into steel. The weight of what she said didn't spark outrage or rebuttal. It sparked something much more devastating. Recognition. Raw. Ugly. Immediate. Caroline Leavitt sat paralyzed in her chair, her body rigid, her hands clutching the armrests so tightly the veins along her wrists stood out. The practiced smile she wore earlier had completely collapsed, leaving only a blank mask struggling to contain the turmoil inside. Her face, normally vibrant with self-assurance, had lost all color, the blood draining out as if Jasmine's words had stripped away every shield she thought she had. She blinked once, then again, but whatever retort she might have prepared shriveled before it could reach her lips. Her throat bobbed in a dry, panicked swallow. Her breathing, once even and measured, came now in shallow, ragged pulls she couldn't fully hide. Cameras zoomed in mercilessly, catching every twitch of muscle, every flash of helplessness, recording the exact moment when pride shattered and left nothing behind but raw exposure. Caroline's mouth opened, just slightly as if to form a rebuttal, but no sound came, only silence. Heavy, damning, absolute. She lowered her eyes at last, staring at the desk in front of her, like it might somehow offer shelter, but it didn't. There was no shelter left, not from Jasmine's words, not from the truth that now filled every corner of the room like smoke after an explosion. The silence inside the hearing room might have held, but beyond those marble walls, the world had already begun to roar, and Jasmine Crockett's quiet demolition of Caroline Leavitt was about to ignite something far bigger than anyone inside could have imagined. The clip hit the internet like a spark dropped onto dry grass. No warning, no time to contain it. Within minutes, Twitter feeds exploded, hashtags piling up faster than anyone could scroll. On TikTok, the footage looped over and over, Jasmine's calm, lethal words cutting through the noise. Caroline's silence bleeding out across millions of screens. YouTube channels lit up with reaction videos, breakdowns, frame-by-frame analysis of the moment a young black congresswoman dismantled an entire facade of denial with nothing but facts and a steady voice. Some people clipped the moment Jasmine said, "Maybe you should read about the crimes you helped cover up," and replayed it like a national anthem. Others spliced it into montages of civil rights marches, protests, historic speeches, as if to say, here in this moment, the fight had never stopped. Every few seconds, another phone vibrated, another comment thread exploded, another wall of the old silence cracked open wider. Across the country, the reaction was not polite, it was visceral, raw, real. In a small diner outside of Birmingham, Alabama, an elderly black man watched the clip on a cracked phone propped up against a ketchup bottle. His hands shook slightly as he pressed replay. Again, again. Not because he had missed anything, but because he needed to feel it one more time. The weight of dignity standing unbroken under fire. At a public library in Detroit, a group of college students huddled around a laptop, their midterms forgotten, their arguments about theory replaced, with the shared electricity of seeing someone speak a truth they had been taught to survive but never to say out loud. In a high school classroom in Phoenix, a history teacher paused mid-lecture, turned the projector toward the live feed, and let the students watch, not explaining, not preparing them, just letting them sit in the moment and feel the current of history moving through their screens. Veterans posted videos from their living rooms, some in full uniform, others just in old worn baseball caps from wars fought long ago. "We fought for freedom," one Marine Corps veteran said, his voice gravel rough but steady. And Jasmine Crockett just showed the kind of courage that doesn't come from a weapon. It comes from knowing the ground you're standing on is already paid for. Teachers wrote open letters, thanking Jasmine for giving their students something real to believe in, something that wasn't a sanitized paragraph in a textbook. Union workers, nurses, engineers, retired grandmothers, people who usually didn't bother with political hearings, found themselves watching, sharing, reposting, with captions like, "This is how you fight back," and "Strength is standing still while the storm tries to swallow you." But not every reaction was simple or celebratory. In living rooms where generations had swallowed the idea that respect was bought by silence, there were tears that didn't come from sadness, but from the shock of recognition. In a small town outside of Kansas City, a mother sat her teenage son down at the kitchen table, pulling up the clip on an old laptop. They didn't speak for a long time after it ended. Then she simply said, "You have a right to be here. Always remember that." In Chicago, a group of older men who met every morning at the same coffee shop to argue about sports sat in heavy silence after watching the clip play out on the TV mounted over the counter. One man, usually the loudest, just shook his head slowly and whispered, "About damn time." Jasmine's words didn't just stay trapped in the hearing room. They spilled out into every place where the quiet, buried things of America lived. They moved through the factory floors, where workers punched clocks but swallowed pride, through the late-night diners where single moms wiped down counters and kept their heads down, through the lecture halls where students were taught the mechanics of government without ever being told how it really felt to be ruled by it, through the living rooms where veterans sat with aching knees and folded flags and wondered what it had all been for. Jasmine's voice was not angry, not pleading. It was the voice of a reckoning that had been postponed too long, arriving at last without apology. Within hours, cable news caught up. Headlines shifted. Crawlers beneath the talking heads changed tone. Pundits, who had expected a minor, contentious exchange, now scrambled to frame the moment, some trying to minimize it, others trying to spin it. But the footage spoke louder than any panel discussion could. Jasmine's calm, unwavering face became a symbol splashed across every major platform. Not as a radical, not as a firebrand, but as a mirror held up to a country still wrestling with its own reflection. In the comment sections, buried between the usual vitriol and bots, real people poured out real stories about being followed in stores, about being pulled over for nothing, about job interviews lost to names too complicated or skin too dark. Jasmine had spoken in a chamber built for laws, but her voice had broken through into the places where laws alone had never protected enough. At a Veterans Hall in Raleigh, North Carolina, a retired Army sergeant replayed the clip on a loop, showing it to anyone who came near. "You see that?" he said, tapping the screen. "That's American. That's what we fought for. Not the noise, the standing." In Miami, a high school senior created a digital art piece in Jasmine's honor, an image of her standing in the Capitol chamber, with roots stretching from her feet deep into the earth, through chains, through cotton fields, through courtrooms, through battlefields, all the way back to the broken ships that had crossed the ocean centuries ago. The piece went viral within a day. Somewhere in a quiet suburban living room, a young girl watched Jasmine's clip on a borrowed phone, under the covers past bedtime. She whispered the words out loud to herself. "I don't need to go anywhere." She said it once, then again, until it sounded like something she could wear like armor. By the end of the next 24 hours, Jasmine Crockett's name was trending across platforms, not just for what she said, but for how she stood. The clip wasn't treated like a scandal. It wasn't twisted into partisan noise. It became something rarer, something that people carried in their pockets, sent to their friends, whispered about at dinner tables. A reminder, a reckoning, a line in the sand. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., long after the cameras had stopped flashing and the hallways had emptied, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, looking out over the nighttime skyline. She didn't smile. She didn't weep. She simply sat there, still and steady, carrying the silence the country could no longer pretend it didn't hear. But beyond the trending hashtags and endless replays, something even more powerful began to unfold. Quiet, raw, and deeply human. Real people, in real rooms, feeling seen. For the first time in ways no speech alone could ever reach. In a small living room in Des Moines, Iowa, under the dim light of an old ceiling fan, a white man named Tom Reynolds sat beside his teenage son, the glow of the television screen flickering across their faces. Tom hadn't planned to watch the hearing. He had stumbled across the clip by accident, scrolling through sports highlights, his thumb hesitating when he saw Jasmine Crockett's name trending. Curiosity had pulled him in. What he hadn't expected, what he wasn't ready for, was the way the room seemed to shrink around them as they watched Jasmine stand there, unflinching, delivering truth with a stillness that roared louder than any shouting ever could. Tom's hands, calloused from years working construction, tightened into fists against his jeans as Jasmine spoke about her ancestors, about iron shackles, about blood paid for a country that still asked her to leave. His son, 15 and gangly and too often sarcastic, didn't make a joke. He didn't shift restlessly. He just sat there, his face pale, his eyes wide, watching. When Jasmine said, "I don't need to go anywhere," Tom felt his throat close up tight, too tight to swallow. His son reached over, without a word, and gripped his father's hand. Tom squeezed back, hard, and for the first time in a long time, neither of them pretended not to understand the weight they had just witnessed. Tears blurred Tom's vision, hot and shameful and cleansing all at once. And when he glanced sideways, he saw tears streaming silently down his son's face too. They didn't speak. They didn't have to. That moment said everything they hadn't known how to say until now. Thousands of miles away, in a sun-bleached front porch chair in Selma, Alabama, Miss Loretta Jennings, a woman who had marched for voting rights in the 60s, who had seen too many speeches and too few changes, sat with an old tablet balanced carefully on her lap. Her fingers, bent and stiff from arthritis, moved slow but sure across the screen. As she pulled up the now viral clip, she watched Jasmine speak, not yelling, not begging, not performing, just standing there, with that steady fire burning low and deadly in her chest. Miss Loretta leaned back, the wood of her chair creaking softly under her weight, the humid air thick around her. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She simply nodded, slow and deep, the way old trees bend in the wind but never break. She remembered 1,000 moments when silence had been weaponized against her, when polite cruelty had carried the sharpest knives. She remembered learning that sometimes the most powerful protest wasn't a march or a song. It was refusing to bow your head when they told you you didn't belong. With a slow, deliberate motion, she opened her Facebook page, her profile picture still the same faded church snapshot from 5 years ago. She clicked into the status box, her hands shaking slightly with the weight of everything she wanted to say, but knew no words could capture. So she kept it simple. Director, unapologetic. She typed, "Not everyone needs to shout. Sometimes one steady look is enough." And then, just beneath it, she added a single link to the video. She hit post and set the tablet down on the side table beside her sweet tea. The night air settled heavy around her, but for the first time in a long time, Miss Loretta let herself believe, maybe not for herself, but for the ones coming after, that some fights didn't have to be fought with fists or flames. Sometimes they could be won by standing still and refusing to be erased. More and more stories poured out, like cracks running through old concrete. A teacher in Michigan described watching the clip with her students, who sat in stunned silence after the final words dropped. A retired police officer in Louisiana, haunted by years of knowing better and doing less, wrote an open letter thanking Jasmine for the dignity she refused to surrender. On TikTok, teenagers stitched together clips of their own family members, immigrants, veterans, factory workers, watching Jasmine's speech and nodding, sometimes with smiles, sometimes with quiet tears. In small towns and big cities alike, people who had never agreed on anything found themselves sending the same link, whispering the same stunned phrases. Did you see her? Did you feel that? She didn't yell. She didn't beg. She just stood. And it wasn't just Black families or Latino families or immigrant families. It was factory workers in Kentucky who knew what it meant to be treated like less. It was veterans in Pennsylvania who knew the cost of a flag and who recognized courage when they saw it. It was students in California who had been told to wait their turn, to lower their eyes, to stay polite in the face of injustice. Jasmine Crockett's voice had slipped past the walls of the Capitol building, past the guarded headlines, and into the bloodstreams of people who were tired, tired of waiting, tired of asking, tired of being told that change would come if they were just patient enough. Tom Reynolds shared the clip on his Facebook page, something he rarely did, writing simply, "Watch this with my boy, we cried. We learned." Miss Loretta's post, meanwhile, spread quietly but fiercely, shared by church groups, college students, retired civil rights lawyers, young activists who had never heard of her before, but who knew wisdom when they saw it. Her words, "Sometimes one steady look is enough," became a rallying cry of its own, not shouted from podiums, but murmured across dinner tables, whispered in classrooms, typed in comment sections beneath Jasmine's video, where strangers told their own stories, finding connection in the space where truth had cracked the old world wide open. In less than 48 hours, Jasmine Crockett's steady stand had become something far more dangerous than a viral moment. It had become a mirror, and people all across the country, for better or worse, were being forced to look into it. While the world outside erupted in outrage, solidarity, and reckoning, Caroline Leavitt sat alone, silent, cornered, and facing a reckoning of her own that no camera could capture. The room felt too large, too empty, the polished wooden table stretching endlessly in front of her, like a cold, judgmental witness. Caroline Leavitt sat motionless at the far end, her hands limp on her lap, the hearing chamber now stripped of its audience, its cameras, its noise. No aides hovered nearby to whisper strategy into her ear. No colleagues lingered to offer whispered encouragement or crafted excuses. The polished doors that had once swung open with self-assured importance now loomed shut, sealing her off from the frantic world outside. She was alone, not just physically, but in the deeper, heavier way that only comes when the layers of justification fall away and leave nothing but bare truth. The adrenaline that had once propelled her sharp answers and proud posture was gone, leaving a hollow ache in its place. She stared at the blank surface of the table, but it offered no guidance, no comfort. There were no talking points left to summon, no spin left to apply. Only the sharp, brutal memory of Jasmine Crockett's words, cutting through her, still bleeding somewhere unseen. Caroline squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the echoes, but the silence only made them louder. She pressed her palms against the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened, desperate to hold on to something solid, something real. And that's when the memory crashed over her. A memory she hadn't summoned in years. A memory she had buried beneath ambition, rhetoric, and carefully crafted detachment. She was 16 again, standing outside the principal's office, her heart pounding with a sick, frantic rhythm. She had been caught with a group of kids she barely knew, arrested for trespassing on private property after a night of reckless teenage bravado. Her parents had been furious, embarrassed. No one had wanted to hear her side. No one except Mr. Daniels, the history teacher with the slow voice and the patient eyes, the one the other kids sometimes mocked for being too soft, too serious. Mr. Daniels, a black man in a school where almost no teachers looked like him, had stepped forward when no one else did. She could still hear his voice, low and firm, telling the principal that Caroline deserved a second chance. That one mistake at 16 shouldn't brand a girl for life. That sometimes good kids made bad choices and didn't need their futures shattered for it. Because of him, the charges were dropped. Because of him, she wasn't expelled. Because of him, she had gotten to go to college, to step onto the carefully paved road that had led her all the way here. She remembered standing in his classroom after the meeting, too ashamed to meet his eyes, and hearing him say, "Everyone stumbles, Caroline. What matters is what you do next." She had nodded, sworn to herself that she would honor that chance, that she would carry it forward. And now here she was, 33 years old, sitting alone after a public humiliation she had crafted with her own hands, replaying words she could never unsay. Caroline pressed her forehead into her hands, the weight of it all threatening to crush her into the polished surface of the table. She realized with a sharp stab of clarity that made her stomach churn, that she hadn't just insulted Jasmine Crockett. She had insulted Mr. Daniels. She had insulted every hand that had reached out in kindness when she hadn't deserved it. She had thrown their faith in her back at them, wrapped in mockery and arrogance. The shame was physical, a heat rising from her chest to her throat, making it hard to breathe. It wasn't the manufactured shame of a bad news cycle or a failed interview. It wasn't strategic embarrassment that could be spun and polished away with a careful statement. This was raw. This was the gutting shame of a truth finally catching up to a person who had spent too long running from it. She saw herself clearly now, not as the polished staffer, not as the rising political star, not as the fighter for traditional values. She saw the small, frightened girl who had been saved by a man she hadn't defended when it mattered most. She saw the woman who had betrayed the better parts of herself without even realizing when it had happened. Caroline leaned back in the chair, her muscles aching from the rigid posture she had forced herself to maintain all day. She felt stripped bare, as if the armor she had built for years, made of rhetoric, pride, and carefully curated distance, had been peeled away in front of everyone, leaving nothing but raw skin exposed to the cold. The images from the hearing flashed through her mind. Jasmine's steady voice, the rising tide of silence, the way even her own allies had refused to meet her eye after the final blow had landed. There had been no rallying around her, no defense, because deep down, they all knew. And worse, deep down, so did she. The minutes dragged by, measured only by the slow, mechanical tick of the antique clock mounted on the chamber wall. Caroline stared at it, feeling each second hammer against her ribs. She thought about issuing a statement, spinning a narrative about miscommunication or being misunderstood. The old reflexes tugged at her, but somewhere inside a quiet voice, one she had drowned out for too long, rose stubbornly through the wreckage. Maybe this wasn't something she was supposed to spin. Maybe this was something she was supposed to sit with. Maybe for once the right thing wasn't about winning the next news cycle. Maybe it was about finally telling herself the truth. Her phone buzzed on the table, lighting up with messages from handlers, lobbyists, party officials. She didn't pick it up. She couldn't. Not yet. Instead, she closed her eyes and let the shame settle deeper. Let it soak into the places pride had once protected. She didn't know what came next. She didn't know if redemption was possible. But for the first time in years, Caroline Levitt didn't feel like an operator, or a fighter, or a brand. She felt like a human being who had failed someone who had once believed in her, and worse, had failed the better version of herself she had once sworn she would become. She opened her eyes slowly, staring at the silent room around her. The same chairs, the same wood-paneled walls, the same cold marble floors that had once felt so sure, so solid beneath her feet, now felt foreign, distant, unfamiliar. She wasn't sure when she would stand up. She wasn't sure what she would say. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. She could never pretend again that this hadn't happened. And whatever she chose next, it would be chosen with open eyes. No more hiding behind borrowed strength, no more cheap justifications. For the first time in a long time, Caroline Levitt wasn't thinking about saving face. She was thinking about saving something far more fragile, something she wasn't sure she even deserved anymore. Herself. While Caroline sat trapped in the heavy aftermath of her own undoing, elsewhere in the city, Jasmine Crockett was stepping into a different kind of spotlight, a place not built on anger or applause, but on something far rarer, hope forged through fire. The hall was smaller than the grand chambers of Congress, but felt infinitely larger in spirit. Simple rows of folding chairs stretched out beneath warm yellow lights, a makeshift stage at the far end, decorated only by a banner reading, Future Leaders Scholarship Awards. No marble pillars, no velvet ropes, just plain, honest space filled with the electric hum of young energy barely contained. Students lined the front rows, clutching certificates, resumes, and dreams stitched together from long nights of study and even longer days of doubt. Parents stood near the walls, some wiping at proud tears, some holding phones aloft to capture a moment they had fought too hard to see finally unfold. At the edge of the stage, organizers whispered anxiously into microphones, adjusting programs and checking watches. They weren't sure if Jasmine would come. After all, the country was still reeling from the wildfire she had inadvertently set. But then the back doors opened, not with fanfare, not with press, but with the quiet inevitability of someone who understood that real battles aren't won in grand gestures. They're won in rooms like this. Jasmine Crockett entered wearing a simple navy suit, no entourage trailing behind her, no reporters snapping photos. Only the low murmur of realization spreading as heads turned, one by one, toward her. A young girl in the third row gasped quietly, her hands tightening around her scholarship certificate like it might float away. Jasmine moved with the kind of calm that didn't demand attention but refused to be ignored. She shook hands with the organizers, murmured polite thanks, and took her place behind the plain wooden podium at the center of the stage. There was no teleprompter, no prepared speech, just a stack of folded papers she barely glanced at. The room shifted, the chatter dying down into something thick, anticipatory. Jasmine waited until even the fidgeting students fell still, the weight of her presence anchoring every breath. When she spoke, her voice didn't thunder. It didn't crack the walls or shake the windows. It moved differently, heavy, steady, deliberate, the way mountains move when they shift deep underground. "I want to tell you something tonight," Jasmine began, her voice low but carrying easily to every corner of the room. "I don't need an apology." She let the words land, solid and unyielding, before continuing. "I need a shift in thinking." There was no judgment in her tone, no bitterness. Only the cold, hard clarity of someone who had fought long enough to know where true victory lies. Jasmine scanned the faces before her. Brown, black, white, hopeful, frightened, determined. And she let herself breathe in the enormity of it. These weren't just scholarship recipients. They were the future battlegrounds, the future victories, the future heartbreaks. Every one of them would carry this night into a world still reluctant to make space for them. Every one of them would know the invisible weight she carried in that hearing room, and they would have to find their own ways to stand beneath it. She placed her hands lightly on the podium, her voice steady as she said, "Sometimes we think the way forward is through anger, and there is power in anger. But sometimes what wins the long fight isn't how loud you roar, it's how long you endure." A ripple moved through the audience. Not applause, not murmurs. Just a tightening, a deepening of attention, like everyone was leaning closer without realizing it. Jasmine drew in a breath, feeling the raw honesty of what she was about to give them. Something stripped of slogans and polished talking points. "You will be tested," she said, her voice roughening at the edges now, not with emotion she couldn't control, but with truth too heavy to disguise. Not once, not twice, over and over. "You will be told to wait, to be quiet, to be grateful for crumbs." She let that hang in the air because she knew every student in that room had already felt it, even if they hadn't yet found the words. "You will be told your anger is the problem. You will be told your hope is naive. You will be told your presence is disruptive." A boy in the back row, no older than 17, blinked rapidly, his shoulders set hard against an invisible weight Jasmine knew too well. She softened her voice just slightly, enough to cut through the rising lump in more than one throat. "But don't let them steal your steadiness," she said. "Don't let them shame your endurance. Sometimes you will win, not because you shouted the loudest, but because you refused to move when they told you that you didn't belong." The students stared at her now, like she was speaking directly into the oldest, hardest parts of themselves. The parts that had survived rejection, survived being overlooked, survived being told in 100 small ways that they were too much and not enough all at once. Jasmine smiled then. Not wide, not for the cameras, but the small, fierce smile of someone who understood the battlefield beneath their feet better than any strategist in any war room. "You are not here by accident," she said, her voice deepening into something like a promise. "You do not have to apologize for your dreams. You do not have to apologize for your presence. You have already earned your place by daring to stand." A long silence followed, the kind that didn't feel empty but sacred, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Jasmine stepped back slightly, letting her final words settle like seeds dropped onto ready soil. She didn't wave. She didn't pose. She simply nodded once, respectfully to the crowd, and stepped away from the microphone, her heels clicking against the stage floor in slow, steady beats. The applause started small, uncertain at first, as if everyone was still trying to find their voice after being handed something too big to process immediately. But then it grew, stronger, deeper, roaring not just from obligation, but from the place inside where real gratitude, real recognition lives. As Jasmine disappeared backstage, she didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel it, the shift, the crack, the slow, unstoppable turning of something that could never be turned back. In that room on that night, Jasmine Crockett didn't win a headline. She didn't win a moment. She won something harder. She planted endurance into hearts that would carry it forward long after the news cycle forgot her name. And sometimes that was how real battles were won. Outside the modest hall, night had fallen over Washington, D.C., but the world beyond those doors was already shifting. Small and visible at first, like the first crack in a dam that would not hold for long. The air outside was cool, the city breathing under the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Jasmine Crockett stood on the sidewalk for a moment. No security detail, no media swarm, just her, the night, and the echo of young voices still ringing faintly from the hall behind her. She slipped her hands into the pockets of her coat and looked up at the sky, clouded but vast, the stars hidden yet surely there. Somewhere inside her chest, the weight of the last few days pressed heavily. But tonight, for the first time, it felt different. Not the burden of fighting alone, not the exhaustion of surviving rooms meant to break you. Tonight, it felt like standing at the edge of something about to break open, not to destroy, but to finally let something larger flood in. Across the street, a small group of students lingered under a flickering street lamp, clutching their certificates, laughing in that uncertain, giddy way that only comes when you realize the future is suddenly, terrifyingly real. One girl spotted Jasmine and froze, her friends elbowing her forward with nervous giggles. Jasmine caught the movement and smiled gently, a small nod that said, "It's okay." The girl hurried across the street, sneakers scuffing the pavement, her hands trembling slightly as she approached. "Ms. Crockett," she blurted out, voice breaking from nerves. "Thank you. You—" Her words faltered, tangled up in emotions too big for the narrow tunnel of speech. Jasmine reached out, steady, placing a warm hand on the girl's shoulder. No cameras, no audience. Just a moment passed from one fighter to another, from one survivor to another. "Don't thank me," Jasmine said quietly. "Just keep standing." Behind them the city hummed. Buses groaning down avenues, windows glowing with life, old bricks holding on to generations of struggle and change. Jasmine knew the headlines tomorrow might forget this night, knew the news cycles would spin away into fresher outrage, newer scandals. But she also knew that what had happened here tonight wasn't built for headlines. It was built for memory. It was built for the long game, for the long, slow, relentless turning of history by hands that refused to let go. As she turned and began walking slowly down the street, away from the hall, Jasmine's mind drifted, not to victory speeches or news interviews, but to smaller things. A teacher's worn-out shoes shuffling down a hallway. A young father's calloused hands gripping his daughter's homework tighter. A tired mother's late-night whisper, "Keep going." In every small act of endurance, in every stubborn refusal to give up, she knew the real battle was being fought. And maybe, just maybe, it was finally tipping. Farther downtown, in a newsroom buzzing with last-minute edits, a producer watched the clip of Jasmine's speech for the fifth time, frowning thoughtfully. At a university campus 2 states away, a political science professor scrapped his planned lecture notes, deciding instead to play the full hearing, uncut, for his morning class. In a dusty living room in Tennessee, an old woman knitted by the light of her TV, the news muted, but Jasmine Crockett's face lingering on the screen, solid and sure. The ripples spread outward, not loud, not explosive, but steady. Steady in the way that mountains are steady. Steady in the way that revolutions, real ones, are born not from one great moment, but from 1,000 small ones stitched together by people who refuse to look away. At a quiet corner of a memorial park, Jasmine finally stopped, her breath curling in the cold air. She leaned against a stone wall, etched with the names of battles long past, names of people who had once been told they didn't belong, who had once been told to go back, to step aside, to stay silent. She pressed her palm flat against the cold granite and closed her eyes. "I don't need your apology," she whispered to the night. "I need your change." Behind her, the city buzzed on. Before her, the long road stretched, dark and uncertain. Jasmine Crockett straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and stepped forward into it without hesitation. She knew the battle wasn't over. She knew it might never be. But she also knew this. Some wars aren't won with shouts. They're won with steps, one after another, until the world finally learns to listen. And Jasmine Crockett had already taken the first one. But even as Jasmine disappeared into the night, her steady footsteps left behind a question far larger than any headline could hold. A question every witness, every viewer, every silent bystander was now being forced to confront. What does it truly mean to stand? In the wake of it all, the clash, the silence, the storm, and the stillness, the true lesson did not live in the sound bites or the trending clips. It lived in the spaces in between, in the quiet reckoning that came afterward, long after the applause faded. It lived in the raw, uncomfortable truth that justice is not a performance, and dignity is not granted by permission. Jasmine Crockett had not demanded power. She had not begged for acceptance. She had stood, calm, unmoved, and in doing so, forced everyone else to decide who they really were when the lights were no longer blinding and the noise could no longer drown out the truth. Her battle was not against a single insult or a single enemy. It was against something older, something deeper, a system of casual cruelty built to teach some people that their belonging was conditional and others that their power was absolute. The human lesson carved from this moment was not about winning arguments. It was about refusing to let the terms of humanity be rewritten by the loudest or the cruelest voice in the room. Jasmine showed that the hardest victories are not explosive, they are endured. They are earned quietly, one breath at a time, by those who choose against all odds to remain standing when it would be easier, safer, even more profitable to sit down. She didn't shame her opponent with rage. She didn't outshout her. She outlasted her. With truth, with patience, with a courage too deep to be rattled by petty provocation. And in doing so, Jasmine reminded a fractured country of something it keeps trying to forget. That the real test of character isn't how loud you can be when you're winning. It's how steady you can remain when the whole world hopes you'll break. Every injustice Jasmine exposed that day, the sentencing disparities, the wrongful convictions, the political manipulation of law, was not new. It was ancient. It was inherited. But she forced a nation that had grown skilled at pretending otherwise to look at it, naked and undeniable. She forced them to see that injustice doesn't survive because it is strong. It survives because too many people decide it's easier to look away. Too many people decide that truth told quietly can be ignored. Too many decide that history is someone else's problem to fix. But Jasmine's stillness was a refusal, an iron-willed, soul-deep refusal, to allow that lie to stand unchallenged. And in the echo of her words, every bystander, every viewer, every comfortable politician was left to grapple with a terrifying, liberating truth. Silence is never neutral. The battle Jasmine fought wasn't about pride. It wasn't about ego. It was about memory. It was about carrying the weight of every ancestor whose chains had built the streets she walked on, whose blood had watered the soil beneath the Capitol dome. It was about knowing that every time she stood silent but unbroken in the face of arrogance and dismissal, she was reclaiming stolen ground. Not with fists, but with presence. Her restraint wasn't weakness. It was warfare of a different kind. It was a lesson written into her bones by generations who had survived not because the world made space for them, but because they carved out their own spaces anyway, against all odds. And the message Jasmine left behind was not just for the ones who looked like her, or prayed like her, or came from the same hard-fought places. It was for everyone. It was a reminder that belonging is not something you ask for. It is something you claim. It is something you live. And it is something you defend not by proving yourself to those who doubt you, but by standing anyway when the ground shakes and the walls close in. Jasmine didn't need Caroline's apology because she understood something far more dangerous to the comfortable order. That the apology wasn't the prize. The changed mind wasn't the prize. The act of standing was. In every classroom where a teacher paused a lesson to show the clip, in every living room where a family watched in stunned silence, in every comment section where strangers reached out with trembling words they didn't know they needed to say, the real victory grew. Silent, relentless, inevitable. Not in grand speeches, not in breaking news alerts, but in the small, stubborn way. Truth changes people when they are finally forced to sit with it and realize it was never about being perfect. It was about being present. It was about showing up again and again, even when the world told you it would be easier not to. Because the greatest revolutions don't start with noise. They start with refusal, refusal to shrink, refusal to apologize for existing, refusal to allow someone else's limited vision to define your worth. And Jasmine Crockett's refusal that day lit a fuse deeper and longer burning than any outrage cycle could capture. In the end, the lesson was simple and devastating and beautiful. You don't always need to shout to leave a scar on the walls of injustice. Sometimes you only need to stand, calm, steady, and unbreakable, and watch as the world cracks itself trying to move you. And when that happens, when the dust finally settles, the people who tried to erase you will realize too late. You were never the one who needed to move. It was always them. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.